The day they took Nicholas Patrick's badge was the quietest day Hartville, Wyoming had ever seen. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, not the kind that follows a good rain or a long Sunday sermon. This was the silence of a town holding its breath. The silence of people who knew something wrong was happening and chose to watch anyway. The sun was already ruthless at 9:30, burning white and shameless over Main Street. Dust floated in the air like it had nowhere better to be. The smell of coffee from Hattie's diner drifted down the street. Warm, ordinary, almost cruel in how normal it felt. Because nothing about this morning was normal. Nicholas stood in the center of the town square. Boots in the dirt, spine straight, chin up. His shirt was clean. He'd made sure of that. They were not going to see him crumble. Not today. Not ever. But Lord, it took everything he had just to keep his hands from shaking. Because they were all there, every single one of them. The baker, the blacksmith, the preacher, mothers holding children who were too young to understand and too old to forget. Men who had shaken Nicholas Patrick's hand, eaten at his table, called him friend. They lined that street like a wall of stone, and not one of them made a sound. Not one of them stepped forward. 20 years. 20 years he had worn that badge. 20 years of cold nights on the trail, of riding into danger before the fear could catch up with him, of standing between this town and everything that wanted to swallow it whole. And this was what 20 years bought a man in Hartville, Wyoming. Silence, and a crowd of familiar faces that suddenly looked like strangers. Then Kevin Gregory walked out, and the air changed. Nicholas felt it before he saw it. That shift, that drop in temperature, that happens when something truly wrong steps into a room. Kevin looked sharp, pressed shirt, clean shave, boots polished like he was heading to church. There was a stillness about him. Not nervousness, not guilt. Stillness. The kind that belongs to a man who has already crossed every line and made his peace with it. He walked slow and deliberate, like a man who owned every inch of ground beneath his feet, like the badge was already his, and this was just the paperwork. Nicholas watched him come and felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, not yet, but crack. The way ice sounds before it gives way beneath you. Because this was Kevin. Kevin, the man who had pulled him from a burning barn with his bare hands. The man who had ridden through a blizzard just to bring him medicine. The man Nicholas had trusted with his back, his secrets, his life. Kevin stopped in front of him, close enough that Nicholas could see the steadiness in his eyes. And that was the worst part. There was no shame there, no conflict, no ghost of the brother he used to be. Just quiet, cold certainty. Kevin reached out and unpinned the badge from Nicholas's chest. That small click of metal, barely a sound at all, hit Nicholas like a gunshot. Kevin looked down at it, turned it over once in his fingers, like he was admiring it. Then he pinned it onto his own chest, slow and deliberate, and turned to face the crowd. Nobody cheered, nobody protested, nobody moved. And Nicholas Patrick stood there in the dirt. No badge, no brother, no town, and understood for the first time in his life that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't an outlaw with a gun. It was a room full of good people who decided that today, looking away was easier than standing up. Now, before we go any further, if you're feeling this story, don't just watch it. Be part of it. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and trust me, you are part of this journey. Now come back, because what happens next? The man who took that badge didn't do it alone, and the person who's going to bring him down? You will never see it coming. It wasn't always like this. There was a time, not so long ago, that a man couldn't remember it, but far enough back that it almost felt like another life. when Nicholas Patrick and Kevin Gregory were the closest thing Hartville had ever seen to brothers. Not brothers by blood, something stronger than that. Brothers by choice, by fire, by the kind of trust that only gets built when two men have stood back to back in the dark and neither one ran. It started in the spring of 1874. Nicholas had just been appointed sheriff of Hartville. Young for the job, some said. Too young. The town council had their doubts. But Nicholas had a steadiness about him that older men twice his age couldn't fake. He didn't talk much. Didn't need to. When Nicholas Patrick walked into a room, trouble usually decided to walk out. Kevin Gregory came to him 2 weeks into the job, hat in hand, asking to be his deputy. He was lean and sharp-eyed, with a quick smile and quicker hands. Nicholas looked him over for a long moment. The way he looked at everything, slow and careful, and then nodded once. That was how it began. No ceremony, no speeches, just two men and a decision that would shape the next 6 years of both their lives. They rode together through blizzards that turned the Wyoming plains into something out of a nightmare. They tracked outlaws through canyons. So narrow the horses had to go single file. They slept on hard ground under cold stars and shared meals that were barely worth calling food. And through all of it, every freezing night, every dangerous dawn, every moment when fear would have been the reasonable response, Kevin was there, steady, loyal, exactly where Nicholas needed him to be. The town of Hartville saw it too. People talked about the sheriff and his deputy the way they talked about legends, with that particular kind of admiration reserved for men who make the dangerous look easy. Children pretended to be them. Old men nodded with approval when they rode past, and Nicholas, who had never needed much from anyone, found himself grateful, genuinely, quietly grateful, for the man riding beside him. But even then, if you knew where to look, the cracks were already there. Kevin Gregory smiled easy, and laughed loud and slapped backs like a man, without a single dark thought in his head. But there were moments, small, quiet moments, that Nicholas would only understand much later, when something else moved behind Kevin's eyes. It happened the first time the town council publicly praised Nicholas at the annual gathering of 1875. Kevin stood beside him on that platform, clapping along with everyone else, smiling that wide, easy smile. But Nicholas caught it, just for a second. Just a flicker, a tightening around Kevin's jaw, a something. He didn't think much of it at the time. Men had their moods. He let it pass. It happened again when a young rancher's daughter brought Nicholas a pie as a thank you for recovering her father's stolen horses. Kevin laughed and teased him about it all evening. But later that night, sitting by the fire outside the jailhouse, Kevin went quiet in a way that had no explanation. A long, hollow quiet that didn't match the easy man he showed the world. And it happened a third time. The time that should have told Nicholas everything, when a visiting judge from Cheyenne referred to Hartville as Sheriff Patrick's town. Not the sheriff's town, not the law's town, Nicholas Patrick's town. Kevin said nothing. He just nodded slowly, staring at the middle distance, with an expression that Nicholas couldn't name then, but would come to know well later. It was hunger, the quiet, patient, dangerous kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply waits. Kevin Gregory had always wanted what Nicholas had. He just hadn't yet found the right man to help him take it. And the man who would hand him that opportunity had been bleeding Hartville's county dry for the better part of 2 years. Robbing ranches, terrorizing settlements, leaving nothing but ash and fear in his wake. Every trail Nicholas and Kevin had ridden, every cold night they had spent hunting shadows, it had all led to him. His name was Ronald Stewart, and he was still out there, Ronald Stewart was not the kind of outlaw who made it easy to hate him cleanly. That was the thing about him that got under Nicholas's skin more than anything else. Most outlaws were simple. They were greedy or desperate or just plain mean, and that made them predictable. Predictable men got caught. But Ronald Stewart was something different. He was patient, intelligent, the kind of man who planned 3 moves ahead and left no loose ends behind him. He had been bleeding Hartville's county for nearly 2 years before Nicholas and Kevin ever got close enough to smell his trail. Ranches hit in the dead of night, clean and surgical, livestock taken, strong boxes emptied, witnesses left alive but too shaken to give anything useful, supply routes robbed with a precision that suggested inside knowledge, settlements on the eastern edge of the county waking up to find their grain stores gutted and their watchmen tied up and blindfolded. Ronald never struck the same place twice, never used the same route, never left anything behind that could be traced back to him directly. He was a ghost with a reputation, and in the Wyoming frontier, a reputation was sometimes more powerful than the man himself. Nicholas had been tracking him for 8 months before Kevin joined the pursuit full-time. Together, they built a picture of Ronald Stewart piece by piece. From frightened witnesses, from the pattern of his strikes, from the rare moments when someone who'd seen his face lived long enough to describe it. Tall, lean, cold eyes the color of a winter sky, a scar along his left jaw that curved like a question mark. He rode with a small crew, never more than 4 men. And he kept them disciplined in a way that spoke of military experience. Nicholas respected that, even as it frustrated him. You couldn't outmuscle a man like Ronald Stewart. You had to outsmart him. And they came close, closer than anyone had before. In the autumn of 1879, Nicholas and Kevin tracked Ronald's crew to an abandoned mine settlement 2 days' ride east of Hartville. They had ridden through the night, pushing their horses hard, surviving on cold coffee and the particular kind of focus that comes when a man can feel he is finally closing in. They arrived at dawn, the sky bruised purple and orange above the tree line, and for one breathless moment it looked like they had him. Horses outside Sissa's settlement, smoke from a fresh fire, voices inside the largest structure, low, unhurried, the voices of men who believed themselves safe. Nicholas signaled Kevin without a word. 2 years of riding together had made words mostly unnecessary between them. They moved in from opposite sides, quiet as the morning itself. Nicholas's heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. This was it. This was the moment. And then one of Ronald's men stepped outside to relieve himself, saw Kevin's shadow move against the tree line, and shouted. What followed was 12 minutes of chaos. Gunfire, smoke, horses screaming, men running in every direction. Nicholas took a graze along his right forearm that burned like a brand. Kevin's hat got shot clean off his head. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 of Ronald's men were in custody. But Ronald Stewart himself was gone, vanished into the tree line like smoke on a windy day, leaving nothing behind but a fresh set of hoofprints heading north and a feeling in Nicholas's gut like swallowed glass. That night, sitting by a fire with his arm bandaged and his jaw tight, Nicholas looked across the flames at Kevin. Kevin was staring into the fire, turning his hat over and over in his hands, the one with the bullet hole through the brim. He laughed softly and shook his head. Nicholas managed a tired smile. They had come so close. They would get him next time. That was what Nicholas believed. That was what he told himself as he lay down on the cold ground and closed his eyes. He had no way of knowing that the next time Kevin Gregory and Ronald Stewart would be in the same place. It would not be as hunter and hunted. It would be as partners. It started with a meeting that should never have happened. 3 weeks after the raid on the abandoned Vine settlement, Kevin Gregory rode out alone under the cover of a moonless night. No word to Nicholas, no entry in the deputy's log, no explanation. Offered the following morning beyond a vague mention of checking a lead on Ronald's northern trail. Nicholas accepted it without question. That was the kind of trust they had built, the kind that doesn't demand accounting, the kind that assumes the best, because it has never been given reason to assume otherwise. But there was no lead. There was no trail. There was only a narrow creek bed 6 miles north of Hartville, where Kevin Gregory sat on a fallen log and waited, and where Ronald Stewart emerged from the tree line on a gray horse, alone, hands visible, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already won an argument nobody else knew was happening. They talked for a long time. The creek moved quietly beside them. An owl called somewhere in the darkness above. And by the time Kevin rode back toward Hartville in the small hours of the morning, something fundamental had shifted inside him. Something that had been leaning for years had finally fallen. Ronald had not threatened him, had not blackmailed him, had not needed to. He had simply done what dangerous, intelligent men do when they find a wound in someone. He had pressed it, gently, precisely. He had talked about Nicholas, about the way the town said his name, about the judge who called Hartville Nicholas Patrick's County, about the pie, about the platform, about 6 years of Kevin Gregory's sweat and blood and loyalty poured into a foundation that another man got to stand on. He had named the thing Kevin had never allowed himself to name, and once a thing is named, it cannot be unnamed. The deal they made was simple in the way that only truly terrible things are simple. Ronald would provide the evidence, manufactured, carefully constructed, impossible to immediately disprove. A witness who would swear he saw Nicholas Patrick accept a bribe from a cattle rustler, operating on the county's western edge. A second witness who would place Nicholas at a robbery he had in fact been nowhere near. Forged documents. A planted strongbox of stolen money buried beneath the floorboards of the jailhouse storeroom where only Nicholas had a key. Kevin would do the rest. He would be the one to discover the evidence. He would be the one to bring it to the town council with the heavy, reluctant air of a man destroyed by what he has found. He would be the one to stand in that town square and remove the badge from his brother's chest. And in return, Ronald Stewart would walk free. His crimes quietly forgotten. The 3 men currently sitting in Hartville's jail, suddenly released on a legal technicality that Kevin, as acting sheriff, would arrange 2 men, 1 deal, and Nicholas Patrick, who was at that very moment sleeping soundly in the jailhouse, his bandaged arm resting across his chest, his face peaceful in the way that only truly unsuspecting men can. Manage had no idea that the ground beneath everything he had built was already giving way. Kevin rode back into Hartville as the first gray light of morning touched the eastern sky. He unsaddled his horse. He hung up his coat. He sat at his desk and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and began to write the first false report. His hand did not shake. That was perhaps the most frightening thing of all. It took Ronald Stewart 11 days to build the trap. 11 days of quiet, careful, invisible work while Nicholas Patrick rode his county, checked on his settlements, and slept the sleep of a man with a clean conscience. The first witness was a drifter named Cole Briggs, a thin, nervous man with gambling debts that Ronald had purchased for the price of those debts plus $50 cash. Cole would swear on a Bible that he had seen Sheriff Nicholas Patrick accept an envelope of money from a known cattle rustler behind the feed store on a Tuesday evening in October. He had rehearsed the story until it came out smooth and certain, the way lies do, when they have been handled enough times to lose their edges. The second witness was a widow from the western settlement named Mrs. Farrow. A harder case, a woman Ronald had not bought but pressured, quietly and thoroughly, through channels that left no fingerprints. Her testimony would place Nicholas at a robbery he had, in fact, spent investigating from the opposite end of the county. The forged documents, receipts, letters, a falsified ledger entry, were the work of a man in Cheyenne who asked no questions and accepted payment in gold. And the strongbox. The strongbox was Ronald's masterpiece. An old iron box filled with stolen cattle money, wrapped in a cloth monogrammed with Nicholas's initials. A cloth Ronald had obtained through means Nicholas would never know. Buried with theatrical precision beneath the floorboards of the jailhouse storeroom. The lock on that storeroom had only one key. That key lived on Nicholas Patrick's belt. Ronald had arranged for a copy to be made 3 months earlier, during the one night Nicholas had been away from Hartville, attending a county meeting in Cheyenne. 11 days. That was all it took to dismantle 20 years. Nicholas woke on a Wednesday morning to the sound of voices outside the jailhouse. Low voices, urgent voices, the kind that stop when a door opens. He dressed without hurrying. He had learned long ago that hurrying toward trouble only made it arrive faster, and stepped outside into a morning that looked ordinary in every way except for the way people were looking at him, or rather, the way they were not looking at him. Eyes sliding away, conversations dying, a child pulled back by her mother's hand for no reason Nicholas could see. He stood on the jailhouse steps and felt it. That particular atmospheric shift that precedes a storm, when the air pressure drops and every living thing goes quiet and still. Kevin came to him an hour later. He looked terrible. That was the first thing Nicholas noticed. The dark circles, the tight jaw, the eyes of a man who had supposedly spent a sleepless night wrestling with something enormous. He was good. Nicholas would give him that. He was very, very good. Slowly, the witnesses, the documents, the ledger. He saved the strongbox for last, and when he told Nicholas about it, his voice broke in a way that sounded so genuine that Nicholas's first instinct, God help him, was to reach out and steady his friend. The town council convened within the hour. Nicholas stood before them and said what any innocent man says, that it was lies, all of it, that he had never taken a bribe, never been near that robbery, never seen that strongbox in his life. He said it clearly and without anger because he believed, he truly believed, that the truth was its own defense. He believed that right up until the moment the council voted, it was unanimous, every hand, not one dissent, and in the faces of the men he had served faithfully for 20 years, Nicholas Patrick saw something that hit harder than any verdict. He saw relief, as if they had been waiting for a reason, as if the badge had always made them uncomfortable. And this was simply the most convenient exit. He walked out of that council room and into a town that had already decided. And the worst of it, the part that would keep him awake in the cold nights to come, was that Kevin Gregory walked out right behind him, wearing an expression of sorrow, so convincing that even Nicholas, even then, was not entirely sure it was fake. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. Nicholas Patrick discovered it in the days that followed. He still lived in Hartville, still walked its streets, still breathed its air and heard its sounds, and saw its faces. But the town had drawn itself closed around him, like a wound sealing over a splinter, quietly, completely, with no drama and no announcement. Just a slow, collective turning away that was somehow worse than anything loud could have been. The general store went quiet when he walked in. Conversations at the saloon died the moment he pushed through the doors. The preacher, a man Nicholas had helped rebuild the church roof with his own hands just 2 summers ago, crossed to the other side of the street when he saw him coming. Even Hattie's diner, where Nicholas had eaten breakfast nearly every morning for 6 years, suddenly had no available tables whenever he appeared at the door. He was not asked to leave Hartville. Nobody had the courage for that. Instead, they simply made the air around him so thin and so cold that leaving began to feel like the only option a man with any dignity had left. He moved out of the jailhouse, Kevin's jailhouse now, and took a room at the edge of town in a boarding house run by an old widow named Mrs. Cale, who either hadn't heard the news or had decided it wasn't her business. She fed him without questions and left him alone, which was the closest thing to kindness Hartville was offering these days. At night, Nicholas lay on a narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to organize his thoughts into something that resembled a plan. It was harder than it should have been, because the thing about being framed by someone you loved, the thing nobody tells you, is that the betrayal doesn't just make you angry. It makes you doubt yourself. It makes you go back through 6 years of memory, looking for the moment you missed, the sign you ignored, the crack you should have seen. And that kind of searching, done alone in the dark, has a way of turning on the man doing it. The darkness came for him on the 5th night. Not all at once. It never comes all at once. It came the way Ronald Stewart operated. Quietly, patiently, one thought at a time. Nicholas lay in the dark and let himself imagine it. Not justice, not clearing his name. Something older and simpler and far more satisfying in the imagination than it ever is in reality. He thought about Kevin Gregory's pressed shirt and polished boots on that morning in the square. He thought about the way Kevin had looked down at the badge before pinning it to his own chest, that half-second of private pleasure that Kevin hadn't bothered to hide because he hadn't thought anyone was looking closely enough. Nicholas had been looking. He thought about Ronald Stewart somewhere out there in the Wyoming night, free, comfortable, perhaps even laughing. He thought about what a man with nothing left to lose could do to 2 men who believed they had won. It felt good, that thinking, warm in the way that whiskey is warm. Immediately, dangerously, with a attached that doesn't show up until morning. Nicholas sat up in the dark and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He was not that man. He had spent 20 years being not that man, choosing the hard right thing over the easy, wrong one over and over, in small moments and large ones, in public and in private when nobody was watching, and it would have been so easy to slip. He was not going to become something else, because Kevin Gregory and Ronald Stewart had decided he should. But the darkness had shown him something he couldn't entirely unsee. That the line between justice and vengeance is thinner than any law book admits, and that on the wrong night, in the wrong room, a good man can stand right on that line and not even feel it beneath his feet. He got up before dawn, washed his face, put on his boots, and walked out into a Hartville morning that wanted nothing to do with him. Because the only thing more dangerous than a man with a plan was a man with nothing left to protect except who he still. Nicholas Patrick was not done, not even close. Kevin Gregory wore the badge like a man who had been starving for years and had finally been handed a full plate. In the first week, he rearranged the jailhouse, moved the desk, replaced the chair, took down the map of the county that Nicholas had pinned to the wall and marked with years of careful notations, and replaced it with a clean, unmarked one. Small changes, deliberate changes. The kind a man makes, not because the old arrangement was inefficient, but because he needs to see his own hand in everything around him. He held a public address in the town square on his third day as sheriff, something Nicholas had never done, preferring action to speeches, and told the people of Hartville that a new era of law and order was beginning. He used the word new 4 times. The crowd listened with particular attentiveness of people who are not entirely sure what they have agreed to, but are too committed to the decision to question it now. Ronald Stewart did not ride into Hartville openly. He was smarter than that. He came quietly, in stages, first sending 2 of his men to take rooms at the boarding house on the south end of town, then appearing himself one evening at the saloon, introduced by Kevin to the handful of men present as a business associate from Cheyenne. Nobody asked questions. Kevin was the sheriff. If Kevin vouched for a man, that was enough. Or, at least that was what people told themselves. Ronald settled into Hartville's periphery like a shadow settles at dusk. Gradually, naturally, until suddenly it was just there, and you couldn't remember exactly when it had arrived. He and Kevin met privately, regularly, in the back room of the saloon after closing. Ronald brought money, Kevin brought access. Together, they began quietly reshaping the county's commerce, taking cuts from supply routes, pressuring ranch owners on the eastern settlements into informal arrangements that amounted to protection, payments dressed up in the language of business. It was subtle enough that most people could pretend not to see it. And in Hartville, pretending not to see things had recently become something of a local specialty. But the town felt it, not all at once, and not in any way that was easy to name, but the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, in your bones and your joints, and some animal instinct older than language. The baker noticed that the supply wagon from Cheyenne was arriving lighter than it used to and charging more than it should. The blacksmith noticed that 2 ranch hands from the eastern settlements had come through town in a single week with bruised faces and tight mouths that didn't want to explain anything. The preacher noticed that Sunday attendance was climbing, not because faith was growing in Hartville, but because frightened people instinctively reach for God when the ground starts feeling unsteady beneath them. And Laura Gregory noticed all of it. She noticed it, the way wives notice things, not through evidence or argument, but through the slow accumulation of small wrongnesses that add up over days and weeks into something undeniable. Kevin came home later, ate less, slept badly. When she touched his arm in the evenings, he would go still in a way that felt less like comfort and more like tolerance. The man she had married, quick to laugh, easy in his own skin, warm in the particular uncomplicated way of a man with a clear conscience, was being replaced by someone harder and quieter and watchful in a way that had nothing to do with law enforcement. She told herself it was the pressure of the new position. She told herself that men changed when responsibility found them. She told herself a great many things in those weeks, the way people do when the truth is sitting right in front of them, and the knowing of it would cost too much. But the thing about the truth is that it does not wait for a convenient moment. It simply waits. And Laura Gregory's moment was coming, sooner than she knew, in a conversation she was never supposed to hear. That would take everything she thought she understood about her life and reduce it to ash in the space of 60 seconds. It was a Thursday evening when Laura Gregory's world ended. She remembered that detail with strange clarity afterward. The specific ordinariness of it. The way Thursday evenings were supposed to mean nothing, were supposed to be the quiet, forgettable middle of a week that simply passed through without incident. She had come to the saloon to bring Kevin his supper. She did this sometimes when his meetings ran late, wrapped a plate in cloth, walked the 3 blocks from their house in the cooling evening air, let herself in through the side door that Kevin had given her a key to. It was something a good wife did, something that required no announcement, no knocking, no warning. She had her key. She knew the layout. She moved through the darkened front room of the saloon toward the back where the light was burning under the door, and the voices were low and steady and completely unguarded, because Kevin and Ronald had been meeting here for weeks without interruption and had long since stopped being careful, the way men stop being careful when they believe themselves untouchable. She was 3 steps from the door when she heard her husband's voice say Nicholas Patrick's name. Something made her stop. Not suspicion exactly. More like that animal instinct that moves faster than conscious thought. The one that says, be still, before the mind has assembled a reason. She stood in the dark with the plate warm in her hands, and she listened. She had not planned to listen. She would tell herself that many times in the days that followed, as if the absence of intention could soften what the listening cost her. But she listened, and Kevin's voice, unhurried and matter-of-fact, in the way of a man recounting something already finished and settled, told Ronald Stewart exactly what they had done. The witnesses, the forged documents, the strongbox, all of it, laid out with a clarity and a casualness that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. Because anger would have suggested conflict. Conflict would have suggested doubt. There was none. Kevin Gregory described the destruction of an innocent man's life the way another man might describe the weather. Laura did not move for a long time after the voices stopped. She stood in the dark of that empty saloon with the supper plate in her hands and felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. The way a river goes quiet in deep winter, not dead but locked, everything that was moving and alive suddenly frozen in place. She thought about Nicholas Patrick, standing in the town square with his jaw set and his spine straight while her husband unpinned his badge. She had been there that morning, had stood with the rest of Hartville in that terrible collective silence. She had told herself, had genuinely believed, that the council had seen real evidence, that the witnesses were credible, that as awful as it was, there must have been truth in it somewhere, because the alternative, that her husband had done this deliberately, had planned it, had sat across from her at their kitchen table every evening for weeks while this thing lived inside him, was too large and too dark to look at directly. She looked at it now. She had no choice. She set the plate down on the nearest table. She walked back out through the side door into the evening air that suddenly felt different against her skin, sharper, more honest, the way air feels after a long illness breaks. She walked home. She sat in the kitchen for a long time in the dark, and then she made the decision that would cost her everything she had built, and everything she had believed, and every comfortable lie she had told herself about the man she had married. She was going to find Nicholas Patrick, not because she owed him anything, not because she was brave. She did not feel brave. She felt terrified and sick and profoundly alone. But she had heard what she had heard. And there was a man out there with no badge and no name and no ally in the world who was innocent of everything they had done to him. And Laura Gregory, whatever else she was not the kind of woman who could carry that knowledge and do nothing with it. She would find him, and she would tell him everything. Laura found Nicholas at Mrs. Cale's boarding house just after midnight. She knocked 3 times, quiet and deliberate. And when he opened the door and saw her standing there in the darkness, Kevin Gregory's wife, the last person he expected, her eyes red-rimmed and her jaw set with the particular resolve of a woman who has already paid the internal price of a decision and is now simply executing it. He stepped aside without a word and let her in. She talked for 40 minutes. She told him everything she had heard, word for word, with the precision of a woman who had spent the walk over rehearsing it, so that nothing would be lost or softened or left out. Nicholas sat across from her at the small table by the window and listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his hands flat and still on the table in front of him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her one question. Was she willing to say it publicly, in front of the town, in front of Kevin? She looked at him steadily across that table and said yes. He nodded once. That was enough. He spent the rest of the night preparing. Not with weapons, not with rage, but with the cold, methodical focus of a man who has been a lawman long enough to know that the most devastating thing you can bring to a reckoning is not firepower, but truth delivered at the right moment in the right place, with the right witness standing beside you. He wrote 3 letters, one to the county judge in Cheyenne, one to a newspaper editor he had known for years in Laramie, and one that he folded and placed in his shirt pocket without addressing. A letter he hoped he would not need but carried anyway, because a man walking into a fire should always know where the exits are. Dawn found him dressed, clear-eyed, and ready. Laura was still there. He had not asked her to stay, but she had, sitting by the window in the gray morning light, with her hands folded in her lap like a woman in a church pew. Not peaceful exactly, but resolved in the way that only comes after the hardest decision has already been made, and there is nothing left to do but see it through. He walked into Hartville at 8 in the morning and went straight to the town square. Word spread the way. Word always spreads in a small town. Faster than fire, carried on nothing but glances and whispers and the particular electricity that moves through a community when something is about to happen that cannot be taken back. By the time Kevin Gregory came out of the jailhouse, 15 minutes later, drawn by the noise and the gathering crowd, there were 40 people in that square, and Nicholas Patrick was standing in the center of it. No badge, no gun drawn, just a man standing in the dirt where they had humiliated him, waiting. Kevin saw him and went still. For just a moment, just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that might have been fear. Then the mask came back down, and he walked forward with his hand resting on his holster, and his voice carrying the authority of the badge on his chest. He told Nicholas to leave. Nicholas didn't move. He spoke clearly, loudly for the whole square to hear. Named the witnesses, named the forged documents, named Ronald Stewart, and the deal struck the creek bed 6 miles north of town on a moonless night. Kevin's hand tightened on his holster, and then Laura stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. The sight of his own wife walking to stand beside Nicholas Patrick did something to Kevin Gregory that all of Nicholas's words had not managed. It cracked him. Not all the way, but enough. He drew his gun. The crowd scattered backward. Nicholas stood his ground, hands visible, voice steady, buying seconds. It was Ronald Stewart who broke it open completely. He had been watching from the saloon doorway, calculating his odds with the cold efficiency of a man who had always known when to run. And he ran. He bolted for his horse at the hitching post, and the movement drew every eye in the square. And in that moment of collective distraction, Kevin Gregory made the worst decision of his life. He ran, too, not away toward Nicholas. The gun came up, and the square erupted, shouting, movement, chaos, and Nicholas moved with a speed that 20 years of frontier law enforcement had burned into his muscles below the level of conscious thought. He took Kevin's gun hand at the wrist, twisted hard, drove an elbow into his jaw, and Kevin went down hard into the Hartville dirt, with a sound that the crowd would talk about for years. Ronald made it 12 feet before 3 men from the crowd. Ranchers from the eastern settlements, men whose livelihoods Ronald had been squeezing for months, stepped into his path and took him to the ground with an efficiency that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. It was over in less than 2 minutes. Kevin Gregory lay in the dirt of the town square, the same dirt where he had stripped Nicholas's badge, with blood on his lip and his wrists, being bound by the very townspeople he had counted on to stay silent. Ronald Stewart was dragged back across the square, finished, exposed, his operations dismantled in the space of a single morning, and the town of Hartville stood in the wreckage of what it had allowed to happen and felt, in the particular, shameful way of communities that have failed someone, the full weight of its own silence, pressing down on it like a stone. The county judge arrived from Cheyenne 2 days later. He was a small, precise man named Judge Alderman, who wore his authority quietly and moved through the proceedings with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen every variety of human failure and was no longer surprised by any of it. The witnesses, Cole Briggs and Mrs. Farrow, recanted within an hour of being placed in separate rooms and told plainly that Ronald Stewart was in custody and could no longer protect them from the consequences of their testimony, Cole Briggs cried. Mrs. Farrow did not. She simply told the truth in the same flat voice of a woman who had been carrying a weight she hadn't chosen and was grateful to put it down. The forged documents were examined by the judge's clerk and declared fraudulent within a day. The strongbox was opened in front of witnesses and traced back to a robbery in Carbon County that had Ronald Stewart's methods written all over it. Kevin Gregory said very little throughout any of it. He sat in the jail cell, Nicholas's old jail, the one he had redecorated with such satisfaction just weeks earlier, and stared at the wall with the expression of a man watching something collapse that he had built with his own hands and could not stop and could not look away from. Ronald Stewart, to nobody's surprise, attempted to negotiate. He offered names, locations, details of operations across 3 counties in exchange for considerations on his sentence. Judge Alderman listened to everything Ronald had to offer, wrote it all down carefully, and then charged him on every count anyway. On the morning of the 3rd day, Judge Alderman summoned Nicholas Patrick to the jailhouse and placed the sheriff's badge on the desk between them. The morning light caught it and it glinted once, that same small flash of metal that had meant everything and nothing on the day it was taken. The judge said the obvious things: wrongful removal, full exoneration. The position was his again, by right and by law, with the formal apology of the county on record. Nicholas looked at the badge for a long time. He did not pick it up. He stood at that desk for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably less than a minute. The judge watched him without rushing. Outside the jailhouse window, Hartville was going about its morning. The sounds of horses and commerce, and ordinary life carrying on the way ordinary life always does, indifferent to the extraordinary, things happening just out of its sight. Nicholas thought about 20 years. He thought about cold trails and hard ground, and every dangerous dawn he had ridden toward because the badge on his chest told him it was his responsibility, and he had believed that completely and without reservation. He thought about Kevin Gregory riding beside him through a blizzard, laughing into the wind. He thought about the town square, the silence, 40 faces that knew him and looked away. He thought about Laura Gregory sitting still in the gray morning light, resolved and terrified, and doing the right thing anyway, and understood that she had shown more courage in that single midnight walk than most of the badge-wearing men he had ever known. He picked up the badge, held it in his palm, felt the weight of it, lighter than he remembered. Somehow, as if something had been taken out of it that couldn't be put back, he set it back down on the desk, gently, without anger. The judge said his name once, a question in it. Nicholas shook his head. He straightened his coat. He picked up his hat from the chair beside the desk and put it on. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at the badge sitting on that desk in the morning light, smalls and silver, and full of everything it had cost him, and everything it could no longer give him. Then he walked out. He did not ride out angry. He did not ride out broken. He rode out the way a man rides when he has settled something inside himself that needed settling, straight-backed, clear-eyed, moving toward a horizon that had no name yet, but felt, for the first time in a long time, like it belonged to him. Hartville watched him go. This time some of them had the decency to feel ashamed. The badge stayed on the desk for 3 days before anyone touched it. Nobody in Hartville ever forgot the man who had worn it. The man they had failed. The man who had cleared his own name and walked away from the reward. And in the years that followed, when people in that town talked about justice, what it really meant, what it really cost, they always came back to the same image. A badge on a desk, and the sound of a good man's horse riding away into the Wyoming morning, unhurried and unbroken, leaving Hartville to reckon with everything it had chosen to be. And that, friends, is where this story ends. Not with a celebration, not with a parade, not with the kind of ending that wraps everything in a neat bow and tells you the world is fair, because the world of the Wild West was never fair. It was hard, and it was honest, and it asked everything of the people who tried to do right in it. Nicholas Patrick gave Hartville 20 years of his life, and it gave him back a frame job and a silence that still echoes. But here is what Hartville could never take from him. His character. The thing he rode out with was the one thing that had always mattered most. And that, from the sheriff's desk, is the only kind of justice that never rusts. If this story moved something in you, if you felt Nicholas Patrick's weight, his grief, his quiet, unbreakable dignity, then you already know what this channel is about. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. There are more stories waiting at the sheriff's desk. Stories about loyalty and betrayal, love and loss, justice, and the terrible gap between what the law says and what is right. Check out the channel and find your next one. Every town had a law. Every law had a story. I'll see you at the next one.